This is the Infrastructure Matters podcast, brought to you by the Futurum Group. We explore the latest developments in hybrid cloud computing and the technology that underpins it. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the latest trends and technologies that are shaping the hybrid cloud computing landscape. The Infrastructure Matters podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Please do not take anything reflected in this show as investment advice. Now your co-hosts, Stephen Dickens, Camberly Bates, and Krista Macomber of the Futurum Group.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Infrastructure Matters. I'm Krista Macomber, and I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Stephen Dickens. Stephen, how are you doing today? Hey, how are you?
On the road today. Not my usual background for the observant people who watch our podcast on a regular basis, but this view is pretty good. It's chaos behind here trying to be on the road and do this from the road, but hopefully the audio on the hotel Wi-Fi manages to stick with us.
Yep. Hey, it sounds good for my end, Stephen. And I know you've got a little bit of a whirlwind tour, not just this past week, but coming up as well, right?
Yeah, it's a crazy few weeks. Every vendor's got an event between now and Thanksgiving, so it seems so. Yeah, crazy. And we'll talk a little bit about where I've been this week and the time I've spent with Lenovo as we go into the show here.
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. But I guess, before we kind of jump into that, why don't we maybe talk about a couple of news-related items that we're seeing happening? I know, as we're mentioning, we're kind of in the thick of it for not only kind of the fall events, but also for some kind of news announcements as well. And I know, Stephen, I am actually fresh off the phone with Veeam. They are actually, the day that this podcast is going to be coming out, they are hosting what they call their Veeam on Resiliency Summit. So that is going to be a virtual event rather than in person, but yet another event for us to kind of, look forward to participating in and being a part of. But so they are announcing their second half of the 2023 update to their Veeam to the Veeam data platform. So that includes their backup and recovery offering. It includes Veeam One, which is essentially kind of their dashboard and analytics tool. And it also includes their recovery orchestrator for DR and failover. So it's always
all
great.
Powered by AI, no doubt.
That's going to be kind of a part of it. And they admitted it leans a little bit more into machine learning, but you know what? That's kind of what we're seeing for a lot of vendors. You know what I mean? It's what we're seeing is that a lot of the times these tools are really grounded in that machine learning to do things like, help kind of IT administrators to make smarter decisions about, maybe backup schedules, and to also do things like have smarter anomaly detection for ransomware recovery and things of that nature.
Are they putting a natural language interface on the front of that in order to help some of those IT ops teams kind of navigate through the interface? Is that coming as well?
Yes, yep. So they're adding that, and then I'll add as well that actually Druva has had an announcement as well regarding kind of a natural language chatbot type feature, and I think this is going to be really powerful in the data protection space because when we think about being able to kind of troubleshoot, or when we think about being able to maybe do things like address kind of a legal query and be able to essentially find information more quickly, just get things back up and running more quickly as well. I think it's really going to help to streamline time for administrators. And as we all know, these teams are very strapped for time. They're very strapped for staff. So I think it has the potential to be very powerful.
I think as we look at the evolution of these tools, you're going to go command line interface, UX, chatbot.
Yeah.
I see that sort of transition from what we're seeing about every vendor, whether it's IT ops tools, whether it's data layer tools. There's always going to be a sort of use the Microsoft Face for a Copilot or chatbot that sits on that user interface. That
Yep.
if in doubt, you don't know where to start, you don't know what question to ask, you can always ask in natural language.
Yep, exactly. It definitely can help to expedite things. And another kind of interesting area is that they're adding some kind of machine learning and also AI to malware detection. So be able
Okay.
to, yep. So be able to identify, malware more quickly, and also feed that information um, into SIEM tools as well. So to be able to do things like better contextualize that information, have faster incident response as well. So again, it really, I think, from the standpoint of cyber resiliency, that's really where we're going to see some benefits here.
Yeah, I think given what's going on in the world, the more tools and more intelligence we can bring to cyber resilience and security, the better,
Absolutely,
for sure.
absolutely. So that's what's been on my radar. So Stephen, I know you mentioned you've been on the road. You've been obviously tracking a bunch of announcements yourself. What has been top of mind for you over the last week or so?
Yeah, so Dave Raffo and I wrote about one of the vendors that we track, SiFive. They launched a new RISC-V set of processors, the P870 and the X390, really sort of focusing in on AR, VR, what's going on with high capacity AI. Really sort of drilling down. It's interesting stuff. Sci-Fi's an interesting company. They've got a valuation in the sort of 250 to 350 million range, um, raised a bunch of capital, really sort of trying to disrupt the semiconductor market against some of the entrenched incumbents with an open source model. There's the RISC-V foundation. Actually, a lady I used to work for, Krista Redmond, now runs, which is part of the Linux Foundation, and that's really trying to bring a open standard approach to chip design and architecture, which fascinating to see that develop. I think we're seeing a lot from SiFive, particularly. They're the big name in the RISC-V space. A lot of people are using that open source kind of chip architecture to bring infrastructure to market. But SiFive's kind of leading the charge there. So really interesting for me to see more going on in the space. I don't cover telco, but I also saw this week that Qualcomm made some announcements on RISC-V. So fascinating to see more going on in that space. And I think we'll see more of that. I mean, semiconductors used to be kind of x86, it was Intel, it was AMD. Now we're seeing a proliferation of custom silicon. Some of the hyperscalers with it, such as Google with TPU, AWS with Inferentia and Trainium. You're seeing Apple with its own chip architecture. At all levels, I think we're seeing a proliferation. So I think there's enough market size for SiFive, and I think with what we're seeing in autonomous vehicles, there's lots of different spaces where we're going to need chips, and the classic sort of x86 architecture from Intel
Mhm.
is fantastic. Still a space for that. Still a huge market for that in PC and server. But I think there's space for all of the rest of these architectures to come on board. Um, on the same thread, a company we've been tracking since MWC Mobile World Congress last year is a company called Qualinx. They made a Series A raise and announced that today being the 19th of October. So we've been chatting to their CEO, Tom Trill, and the team there, um, and they made their raise. So fantastic to see not only innovation on some of the bigger companies, but also sort of in the mid-size with semiconductor, but also seeing innovation with people making Series A raises to bring new custom silicon to market. So fascinating to see.
Absolutely. So I know you touched on kind of a couple of examples, autonomous vehicles being one of them, but what are maybe kind of some maybe industries or use cases that maybe are a little bit underserved when it comes to custom silicon today that you think might be kind of key targets for some of these companies?
Well, I mean, I think for the SiFive piece, the P870 and the X390, they're engineered for high performance compute. You're going to see those in consumer, automotive, and in infrastructure. So they're on their third generation now of that P870. It's aimed at high performance consumer applications, or for use with a vector processor in the data center. So I think whereas previously the innovation was maybe going on at the software level, and maybe it was all application driven, and the application kind of had to take what it was given from a processor point of view. I think with the open source approach from SiFive, it's changed the dynamics in that space. I think the fabs and the the breakage point between um, the chip designer and the fabricator has kind of helped with the innovation here, I think. So it's going to be, I mean, for me, as we see different workloads coming on board, we see autonomous vehicles, you know, I've spent some time with Lenovo, and I'll talk about that next, but we're seeing edge use cases for various AI driven workloads out at the edge, smart retail, cameras to protect shrinkage and those types of things. All of those, they're coming at it from such a different angle that and we're now seeing an explosion in some of those spaces. Um, you know, Tesla's um, earnings were this week. They're still on track to ship 1.8 million cars. I don't know how many chips are in each one of those vehicles, but assume it's 10, maybe even could be upwards of 100 in some of these new vehicles. You do times that by 1.8 million vehicles this year, you can see that there's a market for this silicon and for some of these use cases.
I'd say.
Just
I'd
a
say
little.
so
So,
for sure.
as I
Right?
say, interesting to see Qualinx make an $8 million raise for a Series A as a GPS chip, right up to a SiFive, making strides, and then, been out at Lenovo this week. We'll pivot to that. As part of their analyst briefing, got to spend some time with YY, their CEO and chairman, and Kirk Skaugen and the rest of the leadership team. Lots of innovation going on there. Charles Furland did a great job of talking about some of the edge use cases, and we talked about it there. When you look at that edge roadmap, I tweeted that out. It was all of the different vendors for chip manufacturers were represented in that roadmap. And I think it speaks to the point around just innovation happening at all layers of the stack.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and that was a perfect segue. And I know, Stephen, as you mentioned, you were with the team this past week. I know you're actually going to be out there again next week, I believe.
It's
So,
Lenovo for 2 weeks. They're looking after
yeah.
me.
I mean, I've got some jealousy over here. Um,
And
so yeah. So
they
what
love you
else?
equally, Krista. Don't worry. They love you equally on the storage side.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So what else, I guess, were some of the highlights that you guys talked about? I'm sure some of it was under NDA this past week, given that it was an analyst session. But what else? I know you kind of just alluded a little bit to kind of, the roadmap, the discussion on the silicon perspective. But what else maybe can you share with us today?
Yeah, we've got Lenovo's major event next week, so that I'm
Hmm.
expecting a whole raft of announcements. Their big sort of annual show, Tech World, so that's going to be huge. There's going to be a lot there. Some of the previews they gave us obviously can't mention as NDA, and I expect those announcements to drop Tuesday and Wednesday next week. So you might be listening to this podcast as those drop. I know our team's primed to cover all those announcements, so sort of keep checking on our site for those as they drop. But I think the interesting thing for me, and being former IBM, knew that Lenovo was the home for the x86 server business and the PC business. And as you track Lenovo and get access to their team, they took 48 of us down to Raleigh this week. You really get a sense for how that company is pivoting from being seen as a PC vendor to being an enterprise tech vendor.
Hmm.
Kirk Skaugen, one of the best execs that we get to interact with, super knowledgeable about his business, really got a handle on some of the KPIs. I've spent quite a bit of time with him now over the last few events, and always a fantastic exec. But his narrative and conversation with the market is we're number three in storage, we're number three in servers, we're leading the market on x86 from a PC point of view. You know, you look at that, the scale and breadth, and that one of the phrases that resonated with me from the discussion this week with those guys was they've obviously got Motorola. That business is having its best time for over the last 10 years. The Razor and some of the form factor stuff that they're doing. So everything from pocket to cloud was the phrase. And it really kind of struck for me as applications now are really spanning that whole gamut, whether it's smart retail with cameras, things like the Amazon Go stores that are able, where you can just walk in, there's nobody at the counter, and you just sort of scan your Amazon account or your credit card and then just walk out with the shopping, right through to sort of smart vision. Um, I was surprised and didn't know that maybe as much about Lenovo's devices strategy as I do now, but where they are with VR and AR goggles and glasses for sort of enterprise workloads, rolling those out to schools. So I think the whole spectrum is where somebody like Lenovo is competing. Really robust edge computing environments, rolling those out into smart factories and retail environments. So it's kind of fascinating for me to see that and change my perceptions of what was a PC company of maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago now to a true enterprise player. Everything from smart devices and phones right up to being a huge provider to hyperscale cloud providers.
And that's a really interesting point, Stephen. So I tracked Lenovo closely around the time of the acquisition of the x86 server business, the System X business that used to be IBM's, right? So it's from my perspective, they've kind of been on this journey to be an enterprise player, and I think you bring up some great points around basically why the time is right for them now, right? When we think about kind of marrying what they've kind of carried forward, right, in terms of that more enterprise leaning, x86 server business that they acquired, alongside, of course, the PC end of things. How it sounds like they're kind of marrying that with, as you mentioned, the devices end of things to really capitalize on, this Internet of Things. It sounds like, and as you mentioned, kind of this edge, strategy that we see that being very important today, considering all the edge environments that are in any given enterprise today, so
Yeah,
that's very interesting.
one area I know you cover and sort of track more closely than me, but surprised me in my last 2 or 3 briefings with them has been the market share they've now got in storage. Up to number
Hmm.
3 in storage and moving up those price tiers.
Yep.
So that
Yep.
it's not just entry level sort of server attached storage. It's coming up tiers into that enterprise use case. Their partnership with VMware, their partnership with Nutanix, really
Hmm.
getting into that converged infrastructure and sort of integrated system type approach with packaged offerings. So just fascinating for me.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
So
where do you see them in the storage space, Krista? Where do you sort of are you? I know you track that space closer than I do.
yep. Yeah. So it's interesting. So the way that from my perspective, the way that business is sort of born was, as I mentioned, as they started really kind of making that enterprise push, of course they needed storage, right? Especially if they were going to start selling, the legacy IBM server portfolio and kind of carry that forward from a product development perspective. So I would say it sort of began as that's how they sort of got into it. And like, as you mentioned, I think primarily that's really been the play has been to, as you mentioned, kind of on the Converge side, for example, really fill in those areas with those storage competencies for customers to be able to come to market with a more comprehensive, portfolio and a more comprehensive offering. And as you're mentioning, in terms of the revenue that they're recognizing from it, it's, definitely seems like it's been helping them to get that traction.
Yeah, it's a fascinating company. I mean, as I say, Kirk is one of the best executives. The more time I spend with him, the more bullish I get on Lenovo, which I suppose is the point of them inviting me to Raleigh for the week. But no,
Yep. Yep.
certainly making really strong strides into the enterprise.
Yep. Absolutely. All right, Stephen. Well, with that, I think that kind of concludes all of our discussion for today. So I want to thank you very much. I know it's been a crazy time for you right now with all your travels. So thank you so much for taking a few minutes here to update us today. And thank you to everyone for listening. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode.